Hey, my name is Kara. I'm an ultrasound tech, and let's talk today about my personal experience with having an abnormal nuchal translucency. So, a little bit of background: I've had three pregnancies so far. One ended in a miscarriage, unfortunately, but that was after I had my two successful pregnancies. Now, with those two pregnancies, believe it or not, both of the nuchal translucencies were thickened on both of our daughters. Now, for those of you that don't know, a nuchal translucency ultrasound is essentially just a screening tool that we use. It is going to be a measurement of the fluid at the back of baby's neck, and we combine that with the mom's blood work just to check for a couple of markers in her blood work. So essentially, you combine those two along with her maternal history, and that is going to give you a risk factor for whether or not baby has any sort of elevated risk for chromosomal abnormalities. The most common one we think of is going to be trisomy 21 or Down syndrome, but we can also screen for trisomy 18, trisomy 13, as well as a few other ones for the nuchal translucency scan. So let's back it up. Basically, for the first pregnancy that I had, I remember my husband being there for the dating scan. And then for the nuchal translucency scan, he did ask me if I wanted him to come along. And I just thought to myself, well, it's fine. We're young, we're healthy. We don't have any sort of chromosomal abnormalities or history that runs within our family. So I'm sure it's fine if you don't come along. And one of my coworkers was actually the one scanning me for the nuchal translucency scan. So I'm laying down on the bed, we're chatting away, and she's scanning baby. And then she turns to me and she goes, "So I'm going to tell you right now, things are looking a little bit abnormal, but I'm going to go ahead and grab the doctor, and then he can go ahead and talk a little bit more with you." At that moment, I remember my heart just dropping, and I'm like, what the heck? This can't be happening to me. And also, what kind of abnormality is going on? So she ends up getting the radiologist that was at our site that day, and he comes in and he tells me that baby's fluid at the back of her neck looks pretty thick. So there's a good amount of fluid. For some context, anything over 3 millimeters at the clinic that I work at in Canada is considered abnormal, and anything over 3.5 millimeters is an automatic referral to maternal fetal medicine, which is the high risk clinic where I'm at, even if your blood work is normal. So again, let's remember that there are three components to the nuchal translucency ultrasound to determine your risk. It's going to be the ultrasound, so basically the results of how much fluid is at the back of baby's neck. It is going to be your blood work as well as your combined history. And basically, again, the nuchal is really thick. So essentially, she had a lot of fluid at the back of her neck, which for babies that have chromosomal abnormalities, a lot of them do tend to present with that increased amount of fluid at the back of the neck. Her fluid was 4.7 millimeters. And it wasn't until a couple of months later when I ran into the same radiologist and I was working with him that day, and he saw that I was very much pregnant in my third trimester at that point. He was like, "Oh, yeah, it looks like everything's going along really well. How did it go with the results?" And I ended up telling him, "Yeah, everything went fine," which obviously, spoiler alert, everything was fine with that first pregnancy. And he was like, "Okay, great, that's great." Because that was one of the biggest nuchal thicknesses that I have ever seen. I'm like, "Okay, fantastic. Thank you for not telling me on that day of that that was one of the biggest that you've ever seen, but great." Anyways, so flashback to the nuchal translucency day with our first daughter. We got the news, as in, like, I got the news. And then I called my husband after and I told him that things were looking a little bit abnormal with the fluid at the back of her neck. But we did have a referral to maternal fetal medicine to basically get more testing if we wanted. I went and got my blood work the same day as well because, again, with nuchal translucency, you do have to get your blood work same day. And from that, we realized that the risk that baby had for any sort of chromosomal abnormality did go down with the blood work. So essentially, the thickness of the fluid at the back of her neck did put her at an increased risk for chromosomal stuff going on, but my blood work ended up decreasing that risk. We were still, though, referred to maternal fetal medicine, and we opted to get a CBS done at the time. So, for genetic screening, there are a couple of blood tests as well as the nuchal translucency, which is the scan combined with the blood work. But for a definitive answer as to whether or not baby has any sort of chromosomal stuff going on, a CBS or an amniocentesis is going to be needed. CBS stands for chorionic villus sampling, and amniocentesis is just amniocentesis. We sometimes shorten it to Amnio for short. but those two tests are going to be the actual genetic tests that test the baby's DNA, and that is what is going to tell you definitively whether or not baby actually has a chromosomal abnormality. Again, all the other tests are non-invasive and they're just going to be a screen. So we go in, we get the CVS done, and we met with a genetic counselor that day, and basically we got the procedure done. And the CVS is going to be taking amniotic fluid, and this is done via inserting a needle into the cervix, and then they get a sample of fluid that way, and then they go and test that fluid. So that test was really, really painful for me, anyways. And the radiologist did tell me that it was going to be more painful for first time moms simply because the cervix hasn't been softened before by giving birth. And since that was the case with me, I was a first time mom, it is going to be a little bit more painful. So it was painful. It wasn't ideal, but they got enough of a sample. And I believe it was about a 4-day turnaround time at that point for us to get our results. So the genetic counselor ended up calling us after about 4 days' time, and we were notified that baby did not look like she had any sort of chromosomal abnormalities. But we weren't in the clear yet. So sometimes when we have a thickened nuchal translucency at the back of baby's neck, that is actually due to some sort of cardiac defect. So although the CBS came back clear and that was all great and dandy, and this was at about 12, 13 weeks time, by the way, we still needed to go ahead and get followed up still with maternal fetal medicine for the anatomy scan at around 18 weeks. And we also needed a fetal echo at the time as well, just to check for any sort of heart abnormalities. We got both of those done, and thankfully they all look normal too. And then we had a couple more growth scans after, so I think one in the second trimester and then a few in the third trimester, just to monitor and make sure baby was still doing okay. But everything came back normal, and now she is a healthy 5-year-old, and there were basically no symptoms that came of that thickened nuchal translucency. We have not seen any sort of abnormalities, which is really, really great. But it was a really, really nerve wracking experience, especially for someone who has also been working obviously on the other side of things, where I do a lot of nuchal translucency ultrasounds and I know what all these numbers mean. But thankfully, everything ended up being okay in the end. And with my second one, let's get into that. So, again, flash forward to I guess, a couple years later, we go ahead and do the dating ultrasound. Again, everything looks fine. And they asked me if I wanted to do the nuchal ultrasound again. And I thought, yeah, sure, why not? I do want to know if baby has an increased risk and what are the chances that lightning is going to strike twice. Disclaimer, it did strike twice. And the second nuchal translucency thickness for basically our second daughter was, I believe, 3.7. So again, very much abnormal. And again, we were offered to go to MFN to get further testing. We did opt for a CVS again this time, but unfortunately, with that procedure, they didn't get enough, basically, of the fluid. They didn't get enough fetal cells in there. So we ended up having to go back for an amniocentesis, which is where they go in through your abdomen to get that sample of fluid. The radiologist that did my procedure that day, apparently they pulled him out of retirement for that day, so that was really reassuring. Just kidding. It was, but also I was like, okay, hopefully you want to be here. And I remember him informing me that he was not going to use any sort of numbing or anesthetic on my belly when he takes the sample, just because apparently that hurts more putting on the numbing than it would just to go ahead and go in with the needle. So he did that. It wasn't too bad, honestly. It was a little bit more comfortable than having the CVS done through the cervix, actually. And they ended up getting enough fetal DNA cells. Again, we got a call from the genetic counselor a couple of days later, and she did inform us that our baby number 2 was normal for her karyotype. So essentially, everything looked okay. We went through the same thing with our second daughter, though. We went and got a fetal echo, we got our detailed scan at MFM, and then we got the same kind of follow ups in the second and third trimester just to make sure she was doing okay. And same thing goes with our second daughter. She is totally, quote unquote, normal, and we have noticed no sort of abnormalities or anything pop up, and certainly not because of a thickened nuchal translucency. So, why am I sharing this with you guys? I am sharing this because I do think it's really important to note that these tests that we do, unless it's an amnio or a CVS, all the rest of the exams that we are doing are simply just a screen when it comes to any sort of chromosomal abnormalities that we are trying to pick up. In my case, I guess we just make babies with really thick nuchal translucency, so they just have a lot of fluid at the back of the neck. And although this is usually indicative that there is some sort of chromosomal thing going on, in our case, there really wasn't any. And we did go through the invasive procedures of the Amnio and the CVS, which do carry about a less than 1% chance of miscarriage, but we thought it was worth it. And in the end, it was a lot of stress. It was a lot of worrying and a lot of just thinking, okay, well, all these tests came back negative and they all seem okay. Baby seems fine. But what if they're missing something? And what if that increased fluid at the back of baby's neck is actually from something that they can't even detect? So it was a lot of worrying and honestly a lot of disbelief that I could be having two of my pregnancies just having that abnormality in the first place. But again, this is all just a screening thing that we do, and it's completely optional. So if you're having a similar experience, I do want you to just hold out hope because I've actually heard many other stories in which they say their risk is really, really high for having a baby with chromosomal abnormalities, like 1 in 4, and then baby turns out to be perfectly fine. We are not perfect with all of this testing. Again, these are just screens that we do. And it's not necessarily going to tell you that baby is for sure going to have something chromosomally abnormal with it if we are just doing the screens. Again, CVS and Amnio are a little bit different because they do look at the actual DNA and the fetal cells. But when we are doing these screening tools, they are simply just tools to tell us, hey, you have an increased risk, or no, you do not. And then you will be offered further testing if you would like. And take it from me, who had two pregnancies with very, very abnormal nuchal thicknesses, things can be okay. And although it is really nerve wracking and it is really, really hard not to worry that there is some sort of underlying thing that is causing that thickness at the back of baby's neck, sometimes it can turn out okay, like in both of my cases. Of course, I'm not trying to discount those moms that are going through finding out that baby has some sort of chromosomal abnormality going on, especially if it is going to be something that is potentially fatal to baby. But there is hope still if you have an increased risk of having a genetic abnormality with baby due to these screening tests, that it still could be absolutely normal. Hopefully, this video has been helpful in explaining to you what the nuchal translucency measurement is and also my personal experience. And like always, if you guys found this video helpful, please like and comment and subscribe, and check me out on TikTok too. I make videos over there as well.